Lies of a Tender Heart. Evelyn Hart. Chapter 1. Martha hurried home, glowing with anticipation. In her hands, she carried a large box of vanilla pastries from her favorite Viennese cafe. Martha Blumeli, 35-year-old owner of a quaint souvenir shop on the outskirts of Vienna, was an incorrigible sweet tooth. Not even the persistent battle with the extra weight she had been gaining over the years could tame her insatiable passion for all things sugary. After all, what else could so instantly and reliably lift a woman's spirits as a delicate sponge cake with a thick layer of cream, a generous slice of chocolate torte, or a warm, fragrant vanilla bun? As for the few extra pounds on her hips and the steadily vanishing waistline, Martha consoled herself with a phrase she once read in a glossy magazine. Curvy brunettes possess a unique charm. She had wholeheartedly decided this must be true. But it wasn't just the thought of a cozy afternoon tea that made Martha rush back to her apartment. For the past 5 days, a young and exceptionally handsome tenant had been living in her small yet tastefully decorated guest room, and this unexpected presence had filled the usually composed and reserved Martha with a delightful flutter of excitement. She smiled to herself, recalling how during their last, rather trivial conversation, her guest had looked at her with those deep brown eyes. It seemed to Martha that his gaze held tenderness, and that on the brink of his lips hovered the very words she had longed and failed to hear for years. Of course, she was still young, but all her friends were married, and she, Martha, had not even the faintest hint of romance in her life. And this young lodger was so charming, so attractive, and by all appearances well off, if only his manners weren't so lacking. In less than a week, there hadn't been a single day he didn't break one of her precious vases or porcelain figurines, decorations she had lovingly arranged throughout her bright little home. And what was even more baffling, he had never once apologized. But that was fine. She'd polish his manners. That could be fixed. Upon entering her apartment, Martha carefully hung up her beige camel wool coat in the hallway. With the box of pastries in hand, she headed straight for the kitchen. She would make a wonderful cup of tea, invite her tenant into the sitting room, and maybe, just maybe, they would finally have the conversation she had been yearning for. And then came the crash. Martha ran into the kitchen and froze in horror. Her favorite tea set lay shattered on the floor. In the middle of a brown puddle of spilled tea were shards of delicate pink porcelain, sticky trails of strawberry jam, and a rapidly melting heap of sugar. Towering over this domestic disaster stood the elegant young man, calmly brushing sugar crystals from his palms. Martha stared at him in outrage, feeling the familiar warmth creep up her face. She hated how she blushed, cheeks, forehead, and even her round chin, all blotched with an uneven, treacherous red. "What have you done?" she finally managed to say. The young man looked genuinely puzzled by her outburst. "Oh, it's nothing, dearest Martha." Martha trembled. Nothing. Were her lovely figurines nothing too? No. This had to stop, and the sooner the better. "Get out of my house," she said coldly. "But first, pay me for every single thing you've broken." The man turned without a word and walked out of the kitchen. Martha stood there, dazed. Had she been too hasty? Was it really worth giving up a chance at a real relationship over a few vases? But then he returned unexpectedly and placed several banknotes on the crisp white tablecloth. "That's for the days I stayed in your home," he said, his tone frosty. Martha blinked in disbelief. "But you ruined so many things." "That was never part of the agreement," he interrupted sharply and left. She tried to tidy up, but just then she heard the front door slam. Martha rushed to his room. It was empty. His things were gone. He ran off. She moved toward the phone, then let her hand fall limply and sank into a chair. What could she say? That a clumsy tenant smashed all her porcelain shepherds and shepherdesses and left without proposing? Martha sighed and began arranging the pastries on a hand-painted porcelain platter. Chapter 2. No, this is simply outrageous. Elsa gripped the armrests of her chair, glaring indignantly at her husband. "This can't go on any longer. We have to throw him out immediately." But dear, Eric Home began. In stark contrast to his full-figured, golden-haired wife, Eric was a rather slight, balding man in his middle years. He usually gave the impression of being fidgety and anxious, which was the case now too, despite the fact that he was merely reading a newspaper across from his furious wife. Yes, out, Elsa repeated, or soon there won't be a single unbroken thing left in the house. She sprang to her feet, smoothing her flouncy house dress, and planted herself in front of Eric's armchair, fists pressed to her ample hips. She was not one of those modern European women chasing a career or an active lifestyle. Right after their wedding, Elsa had gladly left behind her job as a secretary at a real estate office. Her true realm was the household, children, church, and kitchen. But after giving birth to her first and only child, Elsa was told she could no longer have children. Since then, she had devoted herself completely and obsessively to spoiling her daughter Rosie. The fact that she couldn't give Rosie a little brother or sister cast a small shadow over her life, but otherwise Elsa was content and happy. Though she had no income of her own, she reigned supreme over the household. Normally, she was kind and even tender with her husband. At least, she had been, until the arrival of that impossible tenant. "Just look what he's done to the furniture in the dining room!" she cried, pointing at the old buffet cabinet, now missing the decorative glass in its upper door. "Darling, that's just a minor thing. I've already arranged to have it repaired in 2 days. A minor thing! And the carpet in the living room. He spills coffee on it constantly. The guest bedroom, the bathroom. Every time he uses it, it's a disaster. That man is a savage, a complete monster." Elsa's voice rang with fury, and even her peroxide curls, tied in a little ponytail at the back of her head, trembled in outrage. "Darling!" Eric gave a worried glance toward their daughter. 6-year-old Rosie had abandoned her dolls and was listening to her parents' conversation with wide eyes. She stared at her mother in astonishment. Elsa was usually cheerful and rarely raised her voice. Elsa caught her daughter's glance and immediately turned her attention back to her husband. "This is simply unacceptable!" she cried, throwing up her hands. "I'm going to speak to him right now and inform him we're terminating our agreement. Although really, this should come from you. After all, you're the head of the house." It was perhaps the first time Elsa had ever acknowledged her husband's position as master of the home. Seeing him hesitate, she marched determinedly toward the living room door. "But darling, we can't just kick him out like that. We promised to let him stay through this time," Eric stammered, unsure how to pacify his enraged wife. Elsa turned and glared at him. "Oh yes, we can. Yes, we agreed to host him temporarily. But I certainly never agreed to watch my home fall to pieces. And let me remind you, I made no such promise to anyone." She struggled to find the right word for the tenant who had driven her to this state and then headed straight for the guest room. Her husband trailed behind her like a man walking to the gallows. Elsa knocked sharply on the pale painted door and entered without waiting for a response. For a few seconds, the couple stood frozen, silently taking in the appalling sight. Reclining on the bed, atop a pale silk bedspread, was an elegantly dressed man in his early 30s. His legs were crossed, and he was casually smoking a cigar, flicking ash directly onto the bedspread. He made a clear effort to keep it from landing on his suit, however. When he noticed them, he looked up with a calm, curious expression and took another contented puff of his cigar, which looked suspiciously like a tiny dirigible. This was the infamous lodger who had driven Elsa to the brink over the past week with his eccentric habits. The man and the room around him formed a stark and troubling contrast. He looked as if he had just stepped out of a luxury gift box. Immaculately dressed, impeccably groomed, his hands manicured, his jaw freshly shaved, and a cloud of fine cologne surrounding him. The room, however, was a disaster. It was hard to believe it had once been a tastefully decorated guest room. The furniture was buried under piles of crumpled newspapers, stained with what seemed to be every kind of beverage. A few sheets were bizarrely draped over the legs of upturned chairs. The floor was littered with cigarette butts and several coffee cups, long since spilled. The once lovely silk bedspread was ruined beyond repair, He had been using it as an ashtray, snubbing out his cigar directly on the delicate fabric. "May I help you with something?" the man asked pleasantly. Elsa clasped her hands together tightly and spoke in a tone of forced calm. "We'd like to talk about your continued stay in our home." The man raised his eyebrows. "But I thought everything was agreed upon the day I arrived." He looked at the couple, then added, "Do you perhaps need the room for something else? I'd be happy to move to a different one." The thought of him destroying another room sent a shudder down Elsa's spine. She took a deep breath and replied, "You see, Mr. Woodward's." She stumbled slightly over the foreign name. "Please call me Dylan," the man offered warmly. "My husband and I," Elsa glanced at Eric, who was shifting awkwardly behind her, "must inform you that you need to vacate the premises today." Dylan sat up on one elbow in surprise. His cigar fell from his fingers and landed on the bedspread. Elsa watched it with silent despair. "Leave? But why?" "We agreed I'd stay until the end of the month." He turned a confused gaze to Eric. "Is it about the payment, Mr. Calm?" "My wife is very upset about the damage to the buffet in the dining room." Eric's voice was apologetic. Elsa pressed her lips together in frustration. What a spineless man! And to think he managed an entire department. "I damaged the buffet?" "When?" "You were demonstrating a charming custom," Eric began patiently. "Something about smashing a wine glass after a toast. For good luck, you said." "Yes, that rings a bell," Dylan said distractedly. "But what does that have to do with the buffet?" "Well, your glass hit the cabinet's glass door," Eric explained gently, and shattered most of the dishes on the shelf inside. "The more shards, the more luck." Dylan shrugged. "Besides, the buffet is still functional. Are you throwing me out over a few broken glasses?" Elsa had barely contained herself through this absurd exchange. Now she stepped forward and declared, "No, Mr. Woodward's. We're asking you to leave because you've broken or ruined nearly half the things in our home. And now we'd like to preserve the other half. Furthermore, we're demanding financial compensation for the carpets and the furniture you've destroyed." Dylan suddenly rose from the bed and, dragging a chair to the center of the room, sat down with arms crossed. His once friendly expression vanished. Now he looked at them with icy hostility. "I'm not paying a cent in compensation," he said flatly. Elsa's eyes widened. "You mean to say all this?" She gestured at the room, unable to finish. This scoundrel had no intention of paying for the damage he'd caused. It was unthinkable. There was no mention of compensation in our agreement. And it was a verbal agreement at that. "In fact, if you kick me out, I won't even pay for today." "But we never imagined it would come to this," Eric said. "Our mutual acquaintance recommended you as a respectable man. We didn't feel the need to spell out every detail." "Then you made a serious error in judgment," Dylan said coolly. He pulled out his wallet, counted out a few bills, and placed them on the ruined bedspread. "That's payment for the week," he said, and then reached under the bed to retrieve a fashionable travel bag. To the couple's astonishment, the bag was already packed. He knew this was coming. Elsa thought, stunned. At the door, Dylan turned, offered a polite bow, and said, "It's a shame to leave such a hospitable home, but I must be off. A pleasure meeting you both." And with a dazzling smile, he walked out of their lives forever. That very evening, a plane carried Dylan Woodwards from Munich to Cleveland.